Thank you for your time, Julia.
Thank you.
Well, Paris is on high alert as anti-government protesters take to the streets for the fourth consecutive weekend. Police fired tear gas and arrested more than 700 people this morning. Around 89,000 security forces have been deployed around France, and tourist attractions and shops in the capital have been forced to close. Copycat protests have been rumored in Belgium as well. Charlie Daggett reports from Paris.
Well, just over my shoulder there, you can see the beginning of the Champs-Élysées just to the left of the Arc de Triomphe, and it looks pretty with the Christmas lights, but it has been the focus of some pretty ugly scenes today that we witnessed ourselves. Now, it started out relatively peaceful. A few hundred demonstrators had gathered. It soon grew to a crowd of thousands, and every now and then they would square off against riot police. Riot police were answering back with volleys of tear gas and stun grenades. But we're also able to travel a little bit further away from the Champs-Élysées, and it just gave you an understanding of how difficult it has been for security personnel here. There have been 500 or so arrests. Dozens of people have been injured. And what we saw was scenes of looting, smashing out shop windows, especially banks were targeted. All the ATMs that we crossed had been smashed up. And this is the violence that French authorities were worried about. Now, they deployed 89,000 security personnel this time because they didn't want a repeat of what happened last week, where it got much worse, and they were able to actually take over the Arc de Triomphe. We haven't seen those scenes today. Now, these demonstrations began several weeks ago in protest of French President Emmanuel Macron's decision to hike the fuel tax. He has since climbed down from that decision, but it's been too little, too late, because all we've seen is these demonstrations have been growing week by week. And many of the people that we spoke to today said they're not going to be happy until the French president actually resigns. Rena?
Well, for more now, I'm joined by Washington Post foreign correspondent James McCauley. He joins us from Paris. James, what's the latest? What are you saying?
So I think that there is this tendency in the U.S. to be fascinated by the so-called Paris is burning narrative. And that is certainly, we've seen versions of that over the past couple of weeks. But I don't know, this is the fourth weekend of the protests, as you mentioned. And, the numbers are actually decreasing significantly, even though, of course, some of the footage is really striking. I was there on the Champs-Élysées this morning. There was periodic tear gas to clear away protesters. There have been, burning cars, that sort of thing. But, this is in Paris, this is 8,000 people, more or less, that we're talking about. So in a city of, 2.2 million, it's important to remember the context. I mean, is this really the kind of new French Revolution? I'm not so sure about that, as dramatic as the footage indeed has been. And which is not to say that it's not a very kind of seminal moment for President Emmanuel Macron. But, when this first began 4 weekends ago, there were something like 280,000 protesters mobilized all throughout France. And today, at least at the midday mark, the government announced that only about 31,000 in the entire country were mobilized. So, we are really seeing a steep drop as intense as some of the footage remains. So, I think that's just important to keep in mind because, of course, the pictures start to tell a different story.
They certainly do. James, you mentioned French President Emmanuel Macron. He had backed down on the fuel tax increase this week. But what are the issues that these protesters are focused on now?
Yeah, that's a really, in many ways, the key question. This is really not about the climate question at all, at least not at this point. That was, of course, where this all began with the tax on diesel fuels, which, many of these protesters live in the provinces. They drive. There's no public transportation, and that makes it more expensive for them to live their daily lives. So that's where this started. But now this is really just a rejection of Emmanuel Macron himself, the man, and not really any particular policy of his. And I was at the Champs-Élysées all morning, and really, the people that you meet there, the protesters, they really just very much dislike and in some cases hate this president that they perceive to be, as they say, the president of the rich. They see him as aloof, as arrogant. as disconnected from the concerns and the problems of ordinary French people. And, it doesn't help that he was a former investment banker who never really rose through the ranks of local politics at a municipal level. So it's really this notion that Macron himself is somehow insulting to an ordinary French voter. And, there have been little instances along those lines for months. I mean, most recently, I think in September, Macron essentially insulted a young gardener who couldn't find work, and told the young man that, well, it shouldn't be so hard to find a job. Just cross the street and you'll find something. And it's words like that. It's really a question of language here. It's words like that that really have offended deeply so many across the country.
James, can you explain a little bit more about the Yellow Vest movement? How did this begin, and what is it that they want now?
Yeah, that also is sort of unclear. So the movement began, as we said weeks ago. It's very difficult to describe, in fact, like who, in general, the people are, because it really does straddle both sides of the political aisle. It doesn't necessarily affiliate with one particular political party at all. There are, people from the far left, people from the far right, and then, people who voted for Macron in 2017, but who feel disillusioned with what they have received in return. So it's difficult to ascribe any kind of political boundary to it. But then one thing that tends to do the trick, I think, from my experience reporting here in Paris and also in recent weeks in the French provinces, is that these are largely people who are the movement originates in the French provinces and has sort of come to Paris over time. So they tend to be like working class or lower middle class, residents of smaller French cities or towns. And in some cases in rural France, who really kind of feel fed up with what they feel as a rising cost of living and no one caring about what they have to say. So, and then in terms of, the vest itself is part of the whole image, of course, because, it's a high visibility vest that's associated with road workers and such. And, what's interesting about it is that it is itself, something that catches the eye, late at night. You cannot miss it, and that's the whole point of wearing it. And so, in a sense, it is a literal attempt to say, see me, look at me, I am here, and that I think has certainly they have certainly been seen. That we can say for sure.
How exactly do you get a sense from the government there in France on how they plan on responding to these protests over the next few months?
That sort of remains unclear at the point. For the moment, the government has responded in advance of today, like yesterday and the days before that, earlier this week, with essentially just heightening the security measures in place. So last weekend, there were something like 65,000 security forces deployed all over France. This weekend, there's 89,000. So, they raised it after the quite devastating images of the protesters at the Arc de Triomphe last week. And then, so that really it's just been in terms of security. And so they've urged Paris residents to be on guard. Shops have closed, windows have been boarded up, restaurants have canceled, museums have closed, sort of one and all. And but Macron himself has not spoken directly on this, and will do so early this week, or so an Élysée spokesperson told me yesterday. So he'll be speaking in the days that come, but not today or before today, when the protest was sort of building. And then in terms of other responses, the government did withdraw the carbon tax that launched this, but as we said, it was sort of seen as too little, too late, because this is no longer about the carbon tax. That's not why people are in the streets anymore.
James McCauley coming to us from Paris with the Washington Post. James, thank you for your